I would be glad to take questions. I guess we need for you to go to the mic. Is that true? And I take questions about anything. Anybody wants to talk about the financial crisis or anything you want to talk about? Yes, sir.
Well, thank you for coming down here. I really appreciate it. I've been in business for about 10 years. I'm not a business leader. I'm sort of low-level management. Started out at a biotech company, now at a pharma company. And I can tell you in those 10 years, we had our reorganizations, we had our values, and it was about every year and a half, and our whole company could come here and listen to this talk, interesting, and then everyone would go back to work, and they do what they were doing before. And there'd be a small handful of people that would really change how they're doing, really take it seriously. But most people would just, keep doing what they're doing. So my question is, why are most companies, despite their mission statements and their goals and their value statements, why are they so bland and pragmatic? And the other part of my question is, how deep into BB&T did these values go? Did they go all the way through middle management down to the clerks and tellers? Or was it, more something that was infected in your team directly and didn't go much beyond that?
Those are all great questions. First, most businesses, their values are a bunch of bromides and cliches. They typically have embedded in them some kind of altruistic perspective that they don't really intend to live. So the organization has to figure out what the values are. And even when they hold values, they tend to hedge. Classic example, BB&T did lots of acquisitions of mediocre, not bad, mediocre companies. And one observation about a lot of those companies, they would talk about meritocracy. They never said the word justice, right? The meritocracy. But they didn't really have meritocracies. What they had was they may have paid the better people a little more, and they may have paid the poor people a little less, but they never fired any of the poor people. They really were paternalistic organizations. They really didn't incentivize, both psychologically and economically, superior performance. And a lot of businesses do that. And people understand then that that's what the real culture is, not what they wrote. In terms of BB&T, I think why this worked is that I personally believed it really strongly, and we lived it because it worked. Unfortunately, most CEOs are pragmatic, which means a rejection in principle of principles, right? So, and you know that they're going to maybe not be generally honest, but they're not always maybe they're going to fudge around the edges, right? They're not going to be fully disciplined, and that they're going to make decisions that, quote, work in the short term, sometimes drop in the long-term context. We did lots of things that demonstrated that wasn't true. For example, when the Kelo decision happened and the Supreme Court expanded eminent domain, we said we weren't going to make loans for eminent domain. We didn't do negative amortization mortgage loans because we thought it was inconsistent with one of the fundamental goals in our mission statement, which is to help our clients achieve economic success, because we knew we were helping a lot of people get in trouble, and that would come back to haunt us in the long term. So we, in both, was an eminent domain actually happened to work out for us in an economic sense. We didn't expect it to, but negative amortization mortgages, not doing it, made us less profitable in the short term, much more profitable in the long term. But our employees saw those actions. Not only did we have this kind of statement, we had a booklet, we built it into the performance evaluation. Every employee was evaluated on these 10 core values every 6 months. We built it. BB&T invests much more heavily in employee education than our competitors do. We have our own university system. Every educational program, including technically based programs, made a connection to the values. This is how learning this is consistent with our fundamental beliefs. This is why we're doing this kind of, and build it all the way down through the organization. It's kind of a funny story about how that happened. I joined BB&T in 1971. It was a really small farm bank, and I'd been there. I came out of college, and I went into, quote, a management program, but there wasn't really a management program. I was a teller, I was a bookkeeping and all that. And after I'd been there a year, they asked me to develop the management development program. So the first thing I did was install Atlas Shrugged. So all the managers at BB&T, that doesn't mean that they're objectivists, but they all read Atlas Shrugged early on as kind of an entry point. We still, in our leadership development program, do that. So the purpose wasn't to convert people to objectivism, but to give them a certain kind of worldview that was then reinforced down through the organization. So I can't say everybody on the teller line believes in this, but I would say that the vast majority of employees at BB&T at some level understand this philosophy, understand it works, and would say, boy, this is a big part of who we are in this organization. These principles matter to us. And I've had that reinforced many, many times over the years.
Hello.
Yes, sir.
So I really dig about the whole, you shouldn't have conflicting values. And of course, everybody kind of is a hodgepodge of all the experiences that they've had with emotions and all that. But what's the best way to mine out those contradictions? I mean, obviously, if it was something conscious, we'd be like, well, why do I believe that this is great and awful at the same time? So, I mean, I really dig the idea, but like, what would be a really good practice in order to do that, please?
I think in a way that's a profound question because I don't think most people get it. I think you have to do it, on two planes. One, you have to understand the ideas at what I call the top of the mind intellectually. And that's what I just hope we did today with you. Doesn't mean that you agree with all this, but you have to go through the intellectual process. But it's naive not to realize that you've been writing those programs down in your mind, including your emotional programs, since you were very young. And you can't just change those programs at the top of your mind. You have to be able to go rewrite these programs that you're operating on, which are largely subconscious but very powerful and often lead to rationalizations and many evasions. What I did, I went through a multi-year self-awareness process. In fact, BB&T bought a company called Farr Associates. It's in the self-awareness business. And embedded in that program, there's a series of seminars, if you choose to pursue them, where you can bring to consciousness a lot of your subconscious beliefs. And you can actually experience them if you do it long enough. You can see how you drew conclusions in relation to your parents when you were younger. You can actually experience how you made that decision at 5 or 6 years old. And that doesn't make the energy go away, but it does help you understand it, and you can start rewriting those deeper programs. So, give a personal example. One of the things I discovered is that one of my very strong beliefs is I'm not good enough. And I know how I got that belief, and I won't blame my mother, but it was the experience in that I would get all A's and 1 B on my report card, and all my mother liked to talk about was a B, right? So I'm not good enough. That's not all bad. Not being good enough is a good thing. In one sense, it motivates you, but it's not all good either because you're never good enough, right? You aren't as happy as you ought to be, and you can attack other people and blame them when they gave you the information that things didn't work as well as you thought they ought to work. It's their fault that you aren't good enough, right? Through that self-awareness process, I have been able to, over years, and it really takes years, to bring down the energy in relation to that false emotional belief. And actually, the goal there is to help me think more rationally, think more logically. So it's not magical or mystical. It's eliminating a irrational emotional premise, which most of us have. Another premise very common, I have some of this, I'm not lovable. And that a lot of achievers are driven by love. And the experience there was with your parents of when you got positive feedback is when you did something they thought was good, right? You got good grades, or you did, and therefore the way out you get love is by achievement, which is not all bad either, but not all good either, because love's a little more complicated and a little different than that. And so you can discover those false premises, emotional premises. You can bring them to consciousness, and you can definitely radically bring down the energy, and it will literally make you think more effectively. Because a lot of times when we think we're thinking logically, we aren't. We're coming from a false premise that we aren't even aware of because it's so deeply buried in there. And in teams and businesses, going back, maybe you can't change the top of the team, but you can change your team by changing yourself and encouraging other team members to do those kind of experiences. What we would do, we made all of our leadership deep down in the organization go through those self-awareness experiences, and then we would do it together. And one of the interesting discoveries is, I'd been talking to people I knew 10 years, And I suddenly realized that they weren't hearing what I was saying, and I wasn't hearing what they were saying. Because we both had filters, and when we became aware of their filters, and I became aware of my own filters, we at least radically improved the communication process. The reason I think that's an important question, this is not fair, I do think a lot of objectivism get objectivists up here, but they don't want to go through the pain of realigning their deeper belief system to be consistent with this. And therefore, they don't really use the philosophy as effectively as they could. And I see that, frankly, in a lot of objectivist intellectuals, to be honest with you. They won't go through that pain, so they understand it up here, but they don't get it spiritually. And that's a shame, because that keeps you from being as happy as you could be if you're willing to go through that process. Yes, ma'am.
Hello. I was wondering if you've ever had an employee point out that the company isn't actually following its values.
Say that again now.
If an employee has pointed out when the company wasn't following its values,
Oh,
and,
yeah.
and what has happened?
If they were right, we changed. Now, sometimes you'll get a mixed message on that. Sometimes we aren't. The particular case of that would be at an operating level, we have a manager that really doesn't get it, and he or she is operating inconsistent with our values. If we find that out and we find it to be true, we'll fire the manager. That's just, they're gone because they're not acting with it. And that does happen, unfortunately. It happens, every 3 or 4 months. I mean, if you have 35,000 employees, you're going to have somebody that's acting inconsistent, and we'll deal with them. Sometimes you can have that, people use that as an excuse because they're the problem, and they're blaming the organization on it. But I, unfortunately, in my career, have had to fire people that I really liked, had worked for our organization 20 or 25 years, that violated our ethics, and we fired them without hesitation. Wasn't any fun, but we're really explicit, and nobody's going to take your value system serious if you don't live it, including dealing with non-performance or people that violate the ethics. So I would work with people that were struggling to get to be better, but they violate the ethics, they're gone. That's just the way it works. And by the way, I also tried to apply the standards to me more than anybody else, which is something I tried to remember. In any kind of leadership position, or even if you want to influence a team, whether you're a leader or not, make the standards more rigorous for you than anybody else. Yes, sir.
Yeah, Mr. Allison, thanks again for coming out and giving this great talk.
Yes, sir.
It's really been a pleasure to hear you. I'd like to take you back maybe to 2008, 2009. I'd like to get a little bit of sense on your thoughts on what happened. I understand that BB&T did not take TARP bailout funds from the federal government, which, am I correct?
No, I'll tell you a story. You understand what happened?
Okay.
I'll give you a quick, go ahead, finish your.
Oh, yeah, my question to you is, in light of that, I would say that maybe it put you guys at a competitive disadvantage, not being able to overtake your competitors or grow in market share. If Hank Paulson or Tim Geithner were in the room, maybe you've talked to them, or what would you tell them? I mean, what kind of a system, what can we do to change a system that maybe prevented an organization like yours with great values from rising to the top?
Yeah, that's a really, let me give you first, just real quick, what I think, what caused the financial crisis, the kind of the guts of it, and then talk about TARP, and then talk about what I think the consequences have been. Financial crisis was primarily caused by government policy. We don't live in a free market in the United States. We live in a mixed economy. The mixture varies a lot by industry. Technology is probably 20% government, 80% free. Financial services probably 70% government, 30% free. Not surprising, the most regulated part of our economies where we had the biggest problems. Government policy created a bubble of massive misinvestment, primarily in residential real estate, although it was in a number of other segments, primarily in residential real estate. The bubble deflated, which all bubbles do, destroying trillions of dollars of wealth and millions of jobs. Thirdly, a number of large financial institutions made really bad mistakes. If I'd been in charge, I'd have let them fail. But their mistakes were secondary to government policy. And finally, almost everything we've done since the financial crisis started will reduce our standard of living in the long term, even things that might help in the short term. The two primary culprits for time purposes were the Federal Reserve and government housing policy, specifically Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. The Federal Reserve was created in 1913, and many people know that the Federal Reserve exists, and they've kind of studied the Federal Reserve, but they don't intellectually get what happened. The monetary system in the United States was nationalized in 1913. There is no private monetary system in the United States. The government owns the monetary system. If you have problems with the monetary system, which this crisis was based on, by definition, they're government policy problems. It'd be like interstate highway bridges falling down. The government owns the interstate highways, the bridges are falling down. It's the government's fault. The government owns the monetary system. There is no private monetary system. The Federal Reserve was created in theory to reduce volatility in the economy. In practice, what they do is reduce volatility in the short term and create bigger problems in the long term. In a free market, because we're not omniscient, markets are always correcting. Businesses are failing all the time. New businesses are being created. Markets are experiments. And for every Google, there's 100,000 failed Googles. And the experimentation process, all those failures are necessary. It's like Edison and the light bulb. He said it took 1,000 experiments, 900, all the first 999 were equally necessary. When you take out the failure process, all you do is push the problems into the future. And then we had some concrete, specific mistakes. Greenspan wanted to be the hero, and he didn't want to have any bad times, so he pumped up a bunch of money in the early 2000s, created negative real interest rates. And then Bernanke, his follower at the head of the Fed, inverted the yield curve, which meant he drove up interest rates 425% in 2 years, which financial institutions can't deal with that kind of price change. Can you imagine that kind of price change in almost anything and how you would manage it? And then he inverted the yield curve where short-term rates went above long-term rates. Banks borrow short, lend long. That's how they make money. We were buying watermelons for $10 and selling them for $8. Caused people to take a lot of risk in the business. The Federal Reserve basically created the possibility of a bubble by printing money. Couldn't happen. And then the other big culprit was government housing policy. Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, these giant government-sponsored enterprises, had a goal set by Bill Clinton, this was actually happened in 1999, to have half their loan portfolio of affordable housing, now subprime lending. These guys are so big that in order to get that volume, they had to drive up house production to enormous scales to meet the goal that Clinton and Congress set. When Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae failed, they owed $5 trillion, which you now owe, congratulations. Of that $5 trillion, $2 trillion was a bad loan for subprime mortgages. They dominated the subprime lending business. I was on a committee for 10 years of the Financial Services Roundtable, which is the 100 largest banks, trying to do something about Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae. We were running the numbers. It was absolutely mathematically certain they were going broke. I met with Congress on a number of occasions, people like Barney Frank, who I call the evil one, and Chris Dodd. And it was bizarre is the only word I have. Everybody in here, a 15-year-old, would have looked at the numbers and said, these guys are going broke. Congress would look at it and say, oh. And two reasons. One, was, I would call it a religious belief in affordable housing by a guy like Barney Frank, who, by the way, happens to be smart. That's why I call him the evil one. And then secondly, Freddie and Fannie were huge political contributors. They were the single biggest contributor to the Democratic Party and one of the biggest contributors to the Republican Party. So they let Freddie and Fannie cause a huge bubble in affordable housing. So in a very simple sense, the Federal Reserve printed a bunch of money trying to keep us from having a natural correction that we needed. It ended up in a bubble in the housing market because of Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae, and that bubble deflated. And then there was lots of peripheral stuff around it. In terms of TARP, that was a very interesting experience when we talk about rule of law. I was adamantly opposed to TARP. I actually went to Congress. I wrote my congressman. I was the only CEO of a large bank that was saying anything negative about TARP. Because remember, we were regulated by the Federal Reserve and the Treasury, and they were saying we should do TARP, right? And they not just saying we should do it. They said if we didn't do it, it was the end of Western civilization. Remember that? That's how. So anyway, I was opposed to TARP. And then when TARP did get passed, we did take the money. Now, I'll tell you how that happened. The day after TARP passed, we got a call from our regulator, which was the FDIC. It was an interesting phone call. It's very typical bureaucracy. It was in bureaucraties, and this is what the regulator said. He said, listen, he said, John, I know BB&T's got a lot more capital than you need by our traditional capital standards that we've had for the last 20 years. However, we've decided we're going to have new capital standards. We don't know what the new capital standards are going to be. But we know you don't have enough capital unless you take TARP under these standards. And we have an audit team coming in tomorrow to I guess, to say that to prove we're true. And we said, please send us TARP because we had no option. Why did they do that? This is an interesting story. Bernanke's an academic. He did a big study on the Depression. By the way, I don't know if any academics, it was a terrible study. But anyway, he thought whatever he thought it was 1930. Whatever it wasn't 1930. And in the 30s, Roosevelt tried to save individual financial institutions, and it didn't work. There were 3 large banks getting ready to fail. And Bernanke thought if he tried to save those individual institutions, the market would jump on them. So he said, look, if I can force all the $100 billion banks, all the large banks to participate, then it'll obscure what we're doing here, and we'll tell the market we're giving them money to make more loans. So he basically forced all the large $100 billion banks over to participate. Several other CEOs had the exact same story I had, just the same thing happened to them. TARP was a ripoff for healthy banks. We didn't need the money. Remember, they came back and did the stress test the next spring. We didn't need the money. We had to pay an incredibly high interest rate, and they took warrants. We think it cost BB&T between $50 and $100 million. It was just a massive subsidy for the failing banks. They took money out of the pocket of the healthy banks and gave it to the unhealthy banks. That was the way it worked. In terms of your more general question, what a terrible message, and I think this is a non-trivial issue. You can call it the moral hazard issue. In my career, Citigroup has failed 3 times. Every time they've been rescued by the government, every time they've gotten bigger and they've gotten worse. I'll make you a prediction, and I'd say this is the 99th percentile. In the next 15 years, Citigroup will fail again. And probably you'll get to bail them out again. If you can't, by that time you may be broke. You taxpayer may be so broke you can't bail them out. I don't know. But anyway, if all of us aren't broke, we'll bail them out again, which is really it's a terrible message. In the good times, you make less money because you aren't doing irrational risk. And then in the bad times, the government rewards inefficient firms and keeps them in business. And even worse, they've created an artificial oligopoly in the banking business. There are 5 banks that are clearly too big to fail. They have a huge market share, and they have an implicit government guarantee. In fact, the rating agencies will tell you these banks are rated much stronger than they would be if the market didn't expect them to be bailed out if they start to fail by the federal government. And Frank Dodd, the new banking bill, made it worse, not better. It's just a method for bailing them out versus any way to get rid of them. So it's a really terrible message in the marketplace. Here's the way it works. Initially, it's bad for the large companies because they're going to be over-regulated beyond reason initially. But as times get better, those companies will gear up. They'll hire before this crisis happened, and one reason Citigroup got saved, they spent more on lobbying than all the rest of the financial industry put together. They got a lot of crony friends in Washington, right? Those 5 firms will spend a huge amount on lobbying, and they are fundamentally crony capitalists, and they will be subsidized effectively by the taxpayers in one way or the other before it's over. And it will make it harder for the rest of the competitors in the financial industry. It's not happening now. Now they're actually getting the negative end of the stick, right, because they're the bad guys. But in the long term, they'll get the positive end of the stick. So it is actually kind of depressing because the reward system's not too good when that happens. It really is. Any other brave souls? I guess we got a couple more minutes. Yes, sir.
Yes, I recently became an American citizen, so I have the ability to vote. Thank you.
Yay.
Will I, in my lifetime, see an objectivist presidential candidate? And do you have any political aspirations?
I suspect you will see an objectivist presidential candidate in your lifetime. How well he or she will do, I don't know. And I get asked a lot about politics. I am personally not really interested in politics myself. And the reason for that is I think politics are the ultimate reflection of everything else. And unfortunately, we get the politicians we deserve, and that we have to change the culture and the ideas first. My real focus is on universities. I personally in the universities. BB&T has 65 programs in the moral foundations of capitalism. I think the way we got from life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to whatever it is we have today, redistributive state, is the left took over the universities. And Obama is a classic example of somebody educated in a modern university. And we have to take back, I don't know if we have to take them back, but we used to have to get represented at the universities. And we find when students hear our ideas, we are very successful in converting them. But if they never even hear the ideas, we can't possibly impact their belief system. So I think the battle is initially for the universities, and then ultimately politics will follow. Now, there's an argument we got to buy time. So I empathize with those that are in the political arena, because if we go broke when we don't have enough time to change the ideas, but I think the battle is mostly over ideas and mostly over the university. So that's where I focus. I guess we got time for one last question, then we're going to call it. Yes, sir.
I really enjoyed your talk. I thought it was very good.
Thank you.
Would you repeat your formulation? You said something like, do something that is productive that you enjoy doing, and do it the best that you possibly can. Would you reformulate that? Because I really think that's the key to success for a person's life. I never heard that formulation before.
Okay. What I was talking about is in regards to self-esteem, you need to self-evaluate yourself rationally. And that the standard you should set is simply that you're doing something productive, that you enjoy doing it, and you're doing the best you can do it. And if that's what you're doing, then you're morally correct, and your other behavior is moral in that regard. And I think that's important, because I think some people have goals beyond their capability. And that's why I use that story of Michael Jordan. I can't be as good a basketball player as Michael Jordan, right? And if I spend my whole life feeling bad because I can't do something I can't do, then I'm going to be a very unhappy person. And the goal is happiness, right? And the productivity and all that is in the context of pursuing your personal happiness. And some people have too low a goals, right? They don't stretch, and then their minds are underutilized. But I see this in a lot of objectivists. Unless they do something that's wonderful, it doesn't count. Well, you may not be capable of wonderful. Okay, I mean, maybe you don't have the intellectual capacity, maybe whatever. So do something that's productive, that you enjoy doing, and do it the best you can do it, and that's all you should demand of yourself. You should demand that at least, right? but you shouldn't set a crazy standard that unless I invent the next widget or next microchip, then I'm not a meaningful person. That's not a rational standard. That's actually an irrational goal that makes you a lot less happy than you can earn the right to be.
In connection with that, I've also heard actually I formulated it myself once. It's like, do what you love, and do it with all your might. Now, sometimes what you love doesn't actually exist as a career or as a quote productive endeavor, and many times there are certain pigeonhole jobs that just don't interest you or don't really express your capabilities or combination of interest and capabilities. So I personally think that there's a lot of room for potential new ways that an individual could be what they want to be in life, but not be stuck in the so-called rat race out there.
I think that's true. Now, I will say this is interesting, and it relates a little bit to your question, but in a kind of different way. I have a lot of people ask me that when I went to work for BB&T, did I want to be CEO and I want to make a lot of money? Well, I love being CEO and I love making a lot of money, but I never thought about that as a career goal. I had a very different kind of goal. When I went to work for the bank, I wanted to do whatever job I got assigned better than it ever been done by anybody, to really be good at what I was doing, to be world class, and to understand how that work related to the rest of the bank. I really enjoyed being a teller, and I wouldn't want to be the teller for the rest of my life, but I approached, and you get to interface with hundreds of people every day. There are all stories there. There are all kind of financial advice you actually can give over to. It's a pretty interesting job. It's not totally fulfilling for me, but every job I had, I enjoyed it. And I got more jobs because I did those jobs so well. So yes, I think it's fine to have goals, achievement goals, but doing what you do really well and seeing how it connects to other things can make you both better at what you do and also make you enjoy what you're doing a lot. I think a lot of people are so worried about the next step they can't enjoy where they are today. I think we've run out of time. Thank you very much.